What is Jung even about? I want to put a little bit of context around what Jung is, and I don't know if you don't really know, if you haven't read him before, make a little bit of sense of where he kind of fits in the grand narrative of, psychology, philosophy, where it all goes. So, one of his main influences was Nietzsche, and of course Nietzsche proclaimed most famously the death of God. And the significant thing to take from the Nietzsche aspect of Jung's influence is that what the death of God really means is that the floor has fallen from beneath us. Because for a long time, Christianity and the belief in God was the floor. So it was because we were able to believe in Christ, in Christianity, in this worldview. We all lived according to this worldview, and we based the whole organization not only of our societies but also of our minds on that worldview. So Jung saw Nietzsche's issue, and he saw, okay, well, the ground has fallen from beneath us, and he took Nietzsche and Nietzsche's advice, which was to look when we want to rebuild the ground which we've lost, or when we want to at least understand where we are now that the ground has fallen from beneath us. What we should do is we should look to the time before the ground which we had previously stood upon was there to begin with. So what I mean by that is God is dead. So what we ought to do is look to what we used to believe in before we believed in God. So of course Nietzsche took us all the way back to the Greeks, and described a certain grounded aspect of the fact that we were grounded in a different worldview. And that worldview was different to Christianity in the sense that it didn't create for itself an alternative world that justified the sufferings of this world. So the beginnings of the Christian epoch started with Plato, or started really with Socrates, but Plato is the worked out Socrates, the literary book type Socrates, at least according to Nietzsche. So Plato posited this other world as though everything that we experience in the world, which is in the world of appearance, is merely an illusion, and that the ultimate true reality is a higher heavenly reality in which the forms exist. And those are the forms that we recognize a tree because it is an instantiation of the form of a tree. And Plato posited that the world in which the idea of the tree lived was a more real world than the world in which we perceive the tree directly. So before Plato and before Socrates, the Greeks didn't posit such an alternative world. They had what Nietzsche described as a tragic attitude towards the world, which is to say, they knew that death was always on the horizon. And if you look at the Greek heroes and the Greek tragedies, the distinguishing feature of that style is that essentially the heroes are undertaking tasks which are impossible. They are looking down the barrel of a gun and not flinching. So, in his first book, his first prominent work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche talks about how we should reclaim the Homeric Greek, so the pre-Socratic Greek attitude of tragedy, where we go about life with death in mind, and we know that we are like the Homeric heroes, and that we will fail at this mission ultimately, that death is always looming, and that no matter what task we set for ourselves, we will always ultimately fail. But that it is by confronting that we produce beauty. And he went on to distinguishing beauty into the Apollonian and Dionysian, which might be worth just clarifying before I move on. The Apollonian is both the Apollonian and Dionysian are kind of art gods, and Apollo is the god of forms and cultivation and shape. So if you see a sculpture and it's beautiful, the Greeks would look at an uncarved piece of rock and they would intone Apollo and ask Apollo for his guidance in carving out of the rock the most perfect statue. Whereas Dionysus, he was the god of revelry and the god of wine. So you drink the wine and you're overcome with an emotive, expressive, overflowing energy. And to Nietzsche, those were the two halves of art, where we have the powerful, overflowing newness, novelty, and emotion, but insanity at the same time of Dionysus. And then on the other end, we have the cultivating, constructive, precise, organizational, artistic form of Apollo. So, let's move on, getting closer to Jung here. So we'll move on to Freud. And I want to just say that with Freud, he marks a distinction where really psychology was able to take off. And he also marks a distinction in philosophy. So Freud, what he did was he split the conscious mind. And to make that make sense, let's just take a look back at someone like Descartes. And his fundamental assertion was, I think, therefore I am. And the way that reasoning goes is, supposing everything I look at, I could be in a dream. How am I to know that I am in fact awake? And how do I know that I'm not being deceived by some evil demon who has omnipotent power and has simply caused me to believe and to perceive all the things which I perceive? How can I know anything? But he says, I think, and therefore I must be, because even if I am being deceived, or even if I'm in a dream, it can't be the case that I'm thinking and that I don't exist. So I know for certain that I think, and therefore I am. However, to Descartes, this I, which thinks, seems to be clear and distinct to him. It seemed to be something which didn't need to be proved. It was, in a philosophical sense, his mind was transparent to himself. So he could look into his mind and he could see clearly without any distortion what was in there. And that is the foundation of the rationalist philosophical attitude. I know, my mind is transparent to myself. Freud realized that the mind was in fact not transparent to itself. That we often look inside our minds and we think we know what's there, but we act in ways that demonstrate we clearly don't know what's there. So Freud wasn't really the first person to make that distinction. Of course, there was Schopenhauer with his wills, and there was Nietzsche, of course, knew about the unconscious. I mean, the phrase, if you stare long into an abyss, beware that it doesn't stare back. That implies that if we look into our minds, eventually we'll see that there's something in there that isn't us, which is kind of the foundation of a psychological attitude where we split the consciousness. We split our internal world into a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. But it was made much more explicit by Freud. And one of the things that Freud also contributed was that he realized that if you can understand your own mind, if you can learn to understand your own mind, then that will help you to understand the minds of other people. So with Descartes, he thought that the ego was transparent. He thought that his mind was self-evident. When he looked into his mind, he thought it was clear what was there. But he couldn't really prove. He couldn't get out of solipsism. He knew that he existed, but he couldn't really prove without recourse to religious argument that other people or other things existed. And so, if we want to be rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza, we run into a difficulty where we really can't prove the existence of other people. And that can be quite unsettling. But what Freud recognized was that while instead of thinking that my mind is transparent to myself and then being bothered by the fact that I can't see out into other people, Freud thought, well, if I can see into myself, if I realize I am not transparent, but if I can make myself transparent, if I can look into my mind and then bring out the things which are locked inside, and I can bring them into my conscious mind. Freud, one of his main contributions is that if we can do that, then that's the skeleton key to understanding other people's minds. So that may have been implicit in Nietzsche, but certainly Freud made that far more explicit. So in Nietzsche you could say, oh well, I might want to understand, to dig into my moral and psychological foundations, but there's really no claim in Nietzsche that would help you to understand other people. It might help you to understand the human condition, but there's not very much emphasis on the fact that will help you to understand the minds of others, in Nietzsche at least. Okay, so let's move on from Freud onto evolutionary psychology, and put that in obviously I'm going to try and connect evolutionary psychology to Freud. So what evolutionary psychology is really looking into is what Freud described as the id, the unconscious seat of our passions. And so Freud, he was taking a sort of Darwinian attitude where he thought, okay, well, underneath, we are just animals. Underneath our conscious, cultivated, cultural mind, we are animals, and we have these passions. And those passions must follow the law of Darwinian evolution. So, of course, he thought that the passions, therefore, at least in his early career, he thought the passions would be purely sexual. He called it the libido. And the reason for that is that if we are just animals and we're out there to reproduce, then it stands to reason that our ultimate drive, our biological passion, is going to be to reproduce. And Freud thought that drive to reproduce simply manifested itself in multiple ways. And that's a lot of people don't really understand why Freud would deem the unconscious a sexual passion, an entirely sexual passion, or why he would reduce all the passions to sexuality. But the reason he did that was because he was looking at Darwin, and he was saying, okay, we're animals, we're here to reproduce, so if we come into the world with passions, which we do, ultimately those passions must be driving us toward reproducing. So it's from that vantage point, it seems quite clear why he described that as the libido, as the sexual urge, because ultimately human or animal life is a sexual urge. Well, of course, with evolutionary psychology and more recently, we realize that while it is true that we are here to reproduce, to simply reduce those down to a sexual one impulse that manifests itself in multiple ways doesn't really seem to reflect the reality of our minds and also our brains. We have multiple urges. So I think really one of the contributions that evolutionary psychology made, and the extension it made on Freud, was to distinguish between the different passions. So on the one hand, we have a sexual passion, but we also have a social passion. We need interaction with other humans. We need a coherent society in order to be satisfied. And it's not merely an expression of a general will to reproduce that gives rise to that. I think evolutionarily, it's simply the path of least resistance is just to develop an independent social drive. Obviously, at the end of the day, all the passions are directed towards reproduction, but each individual passion can still is still distinct. They're not all manifestations. We don't come into the world with one unifying passion that separates itself out once it learns how learns something about the world it wants to manifest itself in. We actually come to the world with a whole lot of different passions. It's just the idea is that all those passions will drive us towards reproduction. So the next thing, and I kind of hinted at this just before, with the evolutionary psychological attitude, is to recognize that the social environment is in fact the evolutionary environment. So what I mean by that is, we develop our impulses, our instincts, based on our evolutionary environment. If you don't have the right instincts, if your instincts tell you to jump off a cliff, then you're not going to spread your genes. So your jump off a cliff instinct is going to go down the cliff with you. Whereas if someone has an instinct to stay well away from the edges of cliffs, they're going to pass on their genes, and the stay away from cliff edges gene will be propagated. But one of the important things to recognize is that we've been in a social environment for an extremely long period of time, and that has influenced our evolution, the evolution of our brains and our minds, in an extremely profound way. So our whole prefrontal cortex, the thing which distinguishes us from the other apes and certainly from the other animals, is that the reason we have that isn't so that we could use tools or so that we could create language or perform mathematical operations. The reason we developed that was actually so that we would be able to have complex social relationships, because our social environment is so central to our survival. Two heads are better than one. So because having a society that functions became so central to our survival, it meant that if you were born with pro-social genes, those would help you to survive. If you were intelligent, if you had a highly developed prefrontal cortex, that would help you to navigate the social terrain, and the utility of being able to navigate that terrain was incredible in the sense that it allowed you to propagate your genes better. So those who are born into the world with this more than typical social proclivity were selected for, whereas those who are born into the world without the same social proclivity, despite being perhaps athletic, powerful, healthy in many other ways, they still wouldn't have had the advantage or the edge that those built with the social proclivities had. And the conclusion that we have to draw from the evolutionary psychology is that being any time, the gene pool is plastic to the environment. So what that means is that as the environment changes, the gene pool gradually moves towards the change in the environment. Now, of course, it lags behind because the species have to evolve, and that takes time. But as the environment leads, the evolutionary path of the species follows. And so if the evolutionary environment is our social environment, it follows that our gene pool, or that which we bring to the world when we're born, is gradually, over a long period of time, going to merge and morph into, to match the social environment in which we find ourselves. So what that is to say is that we evolve instincts for social behavior. So a lot of our social roles and our social instinct is actually as inbuilt as something like hunger or the sexual drive. So yeah, the evolutionary psychology essentially makes it very clear that we come to the world with social instinct. We have social roles built into us. Of course, you might argue with the evolutionary psychologists and say that maybe they are premature in their conclusion that a particular role is inescapable and biologically determined. But I think it's undeniable that since we evolved in a social environment, we're going to have a whole lot of social roles built straight into our brains. And now, like giving a little background, let's go into what Jung actually is. And I posit that Jung is a kind of proto-evolutionary psychology. So Jung, like Freud, distinguished between the ego and the unconscious. But the distinction between Freud and Jung is that Jung thought that the unconscious was not just a repository of things which might have been conscious or things that were once conscious and have since disappeared from consciousness. Jung thought that the unconscious contained entities which were preformed, whereas for Freud, looking into the unconscious, if there's anything in there, it's either purely sexual in nature, because that was his understanding of the passions, or it's something which was once in the conscious mind and which has since receded into the unconscious mind. And of course, for Freud, anything that has done that would only have done it for the sexual impulse anyway. But if we look at Jung, and we say that he's looking into the unconscious, and he's saying that there are things there to be found. And I hope you're seeing the correlation between that and the evolutionary psychological attitude, which is to say that when we look into our minds, we find already existing things. Because we're social species and we've evolved in a social environment, so it's natural that when we look deep into our minds, we should be able to find social instincts. And Freud didn't find any of those. He just found the raw Darwinian evolutionary reproductive urge, whereas Jung saw a whole array of different forces, and he recognized that those forces organized us in a social world, but also in a physical world. But certainly they're very much tinged by the social processing, the social intelligence which we possess. Now, of course, I don't think Jung would really have understood, or if he made the argument even, I could be wrong, but if he even made the argument that could be compared to the evolutionary psychology one, but the correlation I want to just foreground is the fact that both the evolutionary psychologist and Jung would say that underneath our minds there is a set of distinct roles and instincts that we can find preformed, and that distinguishes them from Freud, whereas Freud would say that it's all just a generic libido ultimately. So now, where the evolutionary psychologists look for those instincts by examining our environment evolutionarily and sort of inferring what roles would be appropriate based on the context. Of course, they try and use actual historical evidence, or I should say archaeological evidence, to justify it. But Jung wasn't in the evolutionary psychologist game, but he did perform a pretty similar operation on myth. So he looked at myths and he saw that across the world we have a whole lot of different religions, different mythologies, but that there are these patterns to them. There are recurrent figures that perpetually show up. The anima, the animus, the shadow, the trickster, the wise old man, the great mother. These are all characters which show up in the mythologies of multiple cultures. And Jung thought that what those reflect, the fact that we continue to reproduce a certain sequence, a certain pattern of characters, suggests that those characters are actually inbuilt in our minds. We come to the world already having those characters. And he therefore concluded that if we can find the patterns in the myth formations of different cultures, and we can see what the sort of universal myths are, then we can understand our universal unconscious. So essentially Jung, you might say, is we're detecting the social roles, the social instincts which are posited by evolutionary psychology. We can detect those in the myths. The social roles which we are born with express themselves in the different myths of our different cultures. And the reason we look to myth rather than modern descriptions of psychology is that we're so far away with the descriptions of psychology. It's so we'd have to look through too much information, too much conscious, worked out, literal information to actually see the patterns below. Whereas with myth, it's much clearer. We're fortunate because these are the stories that people would tell each other before there were books, so they were pretty condensed. So if we see that across a whole lot of different cultures and a whole lot of different environments, everyone's believing in some god that seems like Apollo, or seems like Wotan, or seems like Dionysus, we can safely assume that we come to the world with something like that. It doesn't have to be like a literal image of a god that we're born with, but if everyone's doing it everywhere, it seems that that's the instinct. And if the instinct is to describe some kind of trickster god, then that reveals something deep and built in about our psychology. So I hope that kind of put Jung in a little more context against the backdrop of Nietzsche and Freud, and then contrast them to the evolutionary psychologists. And I'll be candid here and reveal that evolutionary psychology is one of my more introductory, one of the things that I learned about in my introduction to the world of psychology and philosophy. It's one of the things which I first latched onto. I thought it was very fascinating that we could understand our minds by looking to the past and looking to what I can find what's in my own mind by looking at what must be there based on our evolutionary environment. And I think the reason I'm fascinated with Jung is for the same reason. We can look into our minds and we can be aided in our search for what's deep inside our minds by looking at recurring patterns of what human beings have expressed in a way that reveals the deep structure of their minds. So what I mean is when people make their myths, they're expressing a deep structure of their mind. And if we can understand those, then we can understand ourselves better. And if we can understand ourselves better, we can understand each other better. And ultimately, I think that's the key to understanding, that since Nietzsche, the floor has fallen beneath us, and we need to somehow recreate it. And the way we do that is we get in touch with our biology. We get in touch with what we are foundationally. In the sort of Wim Hof biological integrative sense, we're trying to create a smooth, coherent chain between the upper echelons of our self-actualizing intellect and the deepest, most foundational process of breathing. We want to be able to create a smooth journey up and down that we feel comfortable moving in, and then we'll be complete people. And that will be the sense of having a floor beneath us that we lost, and which Nietzsche declared. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.